With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, the most appearances ever on the Heard Tell program. The streak continues, and it extends like one of those bronchiosauruses that you can see behind him if you're watching on the YouTube channel. Michael Siegel, my friend, how are you, good doctor, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
We're hanging in there. Normally we talk science, but since you are in the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there's some political shenanigans about in your state of residence, my friends. So we're going to talk about that first. You've been writing about it in Ordinary Times quite frequently on a couple different things, but with the January 6th committee doing things and the January 6th incident being on people's minds, the GOP nominee for governor, Doug Mastriano, is back in the news. Let's walk through this real slow for the folks in the back and them from Logan that are in overflow, because I don't want to lose people here. But you tweeted about this, the Reichstag fire. Now, I lived in Germany. I know a pretty good amount of German history. This is the cause celeb of false flag operations for a lot of people. This is what they point to. Just walk us through that real quick, if you would, please, sir. That has a lot of meanings to it. Some people see that as a good thing. A lot of people like me see that as one of the great evils of our world, because that opened the door to Nazism in Germany. Just walk us through that real slow, why that kind of rhetoric is very specific and should be very pointed and weighty when we use it.
So what caused this to come up was that Doug Mastriano, who won the Republican nomination for governor since we last talked, compared the prosecution of people connected with January 6th to the aftermath of the Reichstag fire. So in 1933, the Reichstag burned down. And when they investigated, they found this Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, there, and they blamed him for the fire. And then they used that to justify going after Hitler's political opponents and attacking communists. And Hindenburg issued a decree that suspended civil liberties. There were mass arrests, et cetera, et cetera. It was one of the key stepping stones to the Nazis' eventual one-party rule. And so the comparison that Mastriano is sort of drawing is that this is like that they're using the January 6th incident to try to go after Trump supporters, to try to go after conservatives, to try to go after Republicans the same way. So you have the Hitler comparison there, which is egregious enough. But the Reichstag has become sort of a thing with conspiracy theorists that, although at the time no one said this, over the decades, a lot of people think that the Reichstag fire was a false flag. And what false flag means is that it is actually the Nazis that set the fire, and then van der Lubbe was a patsy that they blamed it on so that they would have an excuse to go over communists. And in fact, if you mention this, a lot of people will take it as a fait accompli that it was a false flag. I'm one of those who doesn't believe it was. This wasn't something that was really talked about at the time. Goering joked about it at one point. This is mentioned in Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but it wasn't until decades later that people came to this idea that it was a false flag. But if you look into it, van der Lubbe had mental health problems. He was an ardent communist. He'd been engaged in violent political action before. So it's not that surprising that he would do something like this. But it is, whenever someone mentions the Reichstag, you know that what they're talking about, that's code for false flag. And this has been part of the response to January 6th. I mean, the response to January 6th from people who want to pretend it wasn't what it was has been sort of all over the place. But one of the parts of that is saying, well, it was actually Antifa. It was actually the FBI. It was actually these people creating a false flag so they would have an excuse to make Trump look bad or to go after Trump supporters. And so he's sort of keying into that kind of conspiracy theory paranoia when he brings that subject up.
Now, the Reichstag, just for people that don't know the nomenclature, that's Germany's capital. That's where their parliament sits. That's their main building. It's since been rebuilt. It's a fabulous place to visit if you ever get a chance. They have this great globe structure on top that you can visit. That would be like burning down the Capitol. That's why it's such a direct reference here.
Yeah.
All right. I've tried to be as nuanced as possible when dealing with January 6th. I think you had a couple different classifications of people that were involved there. I think you had the go along, get along mob that was just kind of following everybody else. I think that was the large amount of the people there. I think you had the rioter mob, which was about a third of them from what we can tell, that got violent with people. And then I think you had this small cadre of people, and we're seeing this now in the indictments and the other things that are going through the criminal justice system. There was this cadre of people that was really trying to do something untoward, and it was so half-baked that it was never going to work. I almost hate to use terms like insurrection, things like that, because they weren't going to get anywhere close to that. But they clearly had some kind of a plan to cause major trouble. I think you have to break it down that way. Part of the problem with people like Mastriano is they want to go back to this broad brush where, oh, well, everybody just got caught up in the moment, and it was, well, the FBI coerced everybody into it, or this was just people walking around the lobby and carrying the podium and laughing. And, we all saw the pictures. Frankly, the media didn't help because they were playing up the stupid parts of it instead of the violent parts as it was happening. We all remember that. I think just the fact that he wants to go to the broad brush instead of dealing with what actually happens plays directly into this false flag nonsense. And my rule of thumb on Twitter is anybody that starts talking about a false flag, A, doesn't know what they're talking about, or B, has an agenda, because there hasn't been a successful false flag in years. I think just the fact that he goes to that broad brush and then immediately goes to the conspiratorial, that's very telling to me. Is it to you?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the breakdown is exactly right. One of the things coming out in the hearings is that groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers really spearheaded this, and were engaged in violent acts and so forth. And then there were a large crowd of people that sort of went along with it. And Mastriano, who I will say is cooperating with the January 6th committee and providing information, he's been coy about what happened on that day. He organized buses to bring a lot of people down there. There are pictures of him on the restricted grounds after and near where the barriers were reached, but there's no evidence that he engaged in any violent action. If I had to guess, I would say he was with that crowd that sort of followed the people who were doing violent things but did not do anything himself. That appears to be what the case is. But I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to make that separation, that there were people who were doing bad things. There were people who were not doing bad things, but just sort of there. And there were people who were maybe even trying to stop things. There was videotape of people going to the police, telling them, you need help. This is going bad. And I think that that's a subtle separation that needs to happen. We need to be able to say, these people who did this thing, who did these violent things, were bad. A lot of other people were either misguided or so forth, but weren't engaging in violent things. But there's a tendency to sort of put them all as one blob. And on both sides, there's a tendency for the left wing to sort of see everyone as part of that violent mob, when actually it was a smaller portion of them. I mean, what they did still wasn't right, breaching the Capitol, but it was different than attacking police, smashing down barricades, trying to hunt down members of Congress, that sort of thing. There is sort of a comparison to what happened in 2020 with the George Floyd protests, that you had a mass majority of people who were peacefully protesting, and then you had this small cadre of people who were engaged in using the opportunity to riot and smash things and steal and so forth. And there have been thousands of prosecutions of those people who did that thing without indicting the people who were peacefully protesting.
Here's the thing with Mastriano. We know he was there. We have the pictures. He was on the grounds of the Capitol. I don't think there's any pictures of him being inside the Capitol, but he was on, just broadly speaking, kind of the steps area, the greater outside area. That he was inside the barricades. There's pictures of him around the barricades. There's no pictures of him doing anything illegal or untoward, but he was there.
Yes.
We know that. This came out after you wrote back during the primaries, in fact, the week before the primaries. And I agreed with you. I think he was already unfit for office just based on the things he was saying about the election, some of his personal views on things. I think he's profoundly unfit for office before this. How do we factor this in where He was there. He was an organizer. And again, I'm not saying that as one of the criminal elements. He organized people to be at the event, and he was at the event. How do we add that into this? Because we already agreed that this guy's not fit for office. Is this another layer to it? Does this increase it? How do we even process it? Because we're kind of off the map here with a political candidate that we're already like, this guy shouldn't be in office. And it's like, oh, he's at one of the really dark pages of American history, and this is on top of that. I don't even know where to even start with that, really.
I think it's certainly a factor. To me, the things that make him more unsuited for office are some of the views he's advocated. He was a part of the group that wanted to really push Republicans to overturn the electoral results in Pennsylvania and give the electoral votes to Trump, which I think makes him very unsuited to office. He's also, now that he's governor, advocating a plan, this really crazy plan that, to get rid of dead voters and things like that on the rolls. We're going to unregister everyone in the state and make everyone re-register. And first of all, that's a violation of federal law. It's a violation of state law. You have to rewrite a lot of state laws to do that. It's also would put a gigantic burden on local and state boards that run elections that are already overburdened with trying to keep things going as they are. And it also has sort of a dark history. There were states in the Jim Crow era that made people reregister every year because they knew that was a bigger burden on certain people than it was on other people. Correct. So there's a history there. So to me, the January 6th thing, yes, you should consider that as not as so much that he's an insurrectionist or a criminal. There's no evidence that he did anything criminal on that day, but that it shows a lack of judgment. I think that's a very good point. But I also think you should consider some of the extreme views this guy is advocating in that are connected with the January 6th idea that Trump won the election and was being cheated out of it.
I cannot in my own mind get around the fact that let's just take the bulk of people that was at the rally at the Obelisk, which is the grassy area between the White House and the end of the mall there, where Trump spoke, which kind of kicked this thing off. And then they march up to the Capitol. Taking that mass of people that went up there, and we now know the Proud Boys and that crew had actually left ahead of time to go and presage all this. There's just no way, if you're in that group of people and you attended that event and then you go to walk at the Capitol, you would have to have a complete lack of agency to not know that, okay, this is not good, unless you're completely committed to the cause or you believe what's going on. There's just no way a rational person goes, this massive group of people, especially when they start throwing barricades and stuff. I have no sympathy for anybody that went in the building, because there's no way in your mind that went, oh, this is okay for us to go in the building. And I know a lot of people just walked through orderly and laughed and took selfies and left. I get that too. Mm-hmm. I just can't put my mind around it. I was like, that's the United States Capitol. It's a really, really big building. Like, you don't accidentally walk in there, especially in a mob. Like, I just can't in my own mind forgive it. Like, look, you knew something not okay, or at least not normal, was happening here, and you didn't turn around and leave. And the photos we got of Mastriano is, he's not one of those guys running to the cops going, hey, you need to organize better. You need to call backup. We got people doing it. We got Trump supporters doing that, going to the cops like, this has gotten out of hand. You need to call people. We have video of that. He's not one of those guys. And a lot of these other people weren't either. And I judge him for it.
Yeah, I think it's entirely appropriate to judge someone for something like that. You have mobs get swept up. That's how mobs work. But you have to exercise a personal degree of agency, of judging the moment that you're in, and especially when you're a state legislator, as he was, and you've let a bunch of people down there. You have to take that as a responsibility that you're
former Army officer. Like, he has taken an oath involving this stuff. I hold him to a higher account on that account.
Yeah. And you have to sort of take some agency that because you are in that position of being a state legislature, because you brought people down there, you have a responsibility, to not get swept up in the moment.
Yeah. Michael Siegel. Okay. We're going to take a quick break when we come back. Since we're talking hot button January 6th issue, you wrote about the hottest of hot button January 6th issues. One of the people that did actually die that day, Ashli Babbitt. We'll get into that, your Ordinary-Times piece on that. Our good friend, Dr. Michael Siegel, talking a little politics with our scientist friend, but he's good, level-headed, lots of wisdom. We're going to continue to talk through these really tough issues in a grown folk way with him right after this, as Hurt Tell continues.
This country was built on a distinctly American work ethic. But today, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries. And with that, we sent away good jobs and diminished our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make a variety of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more. All made right here in the USA, from growing the cotton to adding the final touches. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs for seamsters, cutters, and factory workers in towns and cities across the United States. And it's about more than an income. Jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, we're having some grown folk talk about a really tough issue. January 6th, everybody gets heated about it. Everybody's got opinions. We're talking to our good friend Michael Siegel about it. All right, buddy, you at ordinary-times.com, you waded into the deep end of this thing. I'm just going to let you set it up because I don't want to put words in your mouth here because it's such a touchy issue for a lot of people. We talk about the deaths surrounding it, not directly. The one poor individual had a stroke. Did it cause because? I know people debate, who actually got hurt, death counts. The one death that is inarguably connected to January 6th is Ashli Babbitt. Again, I'm just going to let you set it up, but you wrote about it. We've all seen this whole, here's the thing with Ashli Babbitt with me, just to set this up. The entire thing's on video, pretty much from the moment she went into the building to the moment that she was shot. We've got everything she did on video. You can watch almost all, but I think about 3.5 minutes of her time in the Capitol is on video. It's a tough spot because we've all watched it. If the person that shot her waits 30 seconds, that TAC team is there and that situation is probably diffused and that doesn't happen. He didn't have that kind of hindsight that we have. She was going through the speaker's lobby. And for folks that don't know this, the speaker's lobby, members of Congress can't just walk in there. This is a restricted area on a normal day, let alone on a day like this where they're trying to evacuate Congress members. Like you can't just walk in there. There's a door there for a reason, okay? But your take on Ashli Babbitt, and you dealt with who has responsibility for Ashli Babbitt.
Yeah, what actually motivated this was every time the January 6th committee comes up, Ashli Babbitt starts trending on Twitter with people asking for justice for her. And then what actually made me write was seeing people's responses that were like, well, she deserved what she got. And my feeling was, no, she didn't. I don't think anyone deserves to be shot. There may be circumstances where someone has to be shot, but no one deserves to die. But the situation was that you had the speaker's lobby, you had a barricade, you had 3 police officers there with a much larger crowd trying to break in. And she tried to crawl in through a window and was shot and killed. And the investigation by not one, but 2 agencies, the DC police and I believe the Secret Service, concluded that the shooting was justified. And a lot of people are going around saying, she was executed, that she was, trying to stop the rioting or whatever. And these aren't really true. But I feel some sympathy for her. I feel bad for her family. I mean, she, this was a woman who should not be dead. But I don't blame the police for what happened. And usually I'm very skeptical of shootings, but in this case, I think that the analysis, we've all seen the videotape. I think the analysis was correct. And what I talked about was, if you want to affix blame for what happened, I think it goes to Donald Trump and his supporters for the Stop the Steal thing. What's one of the things that's coming out of the January 6th committee was everyone around Donald Trump was telling him, you lost the election. Bill Barr told him that. His children told him that. His son-in-law told him that. Everyone around him was telling that, and he just refused to believe them or just didn't care. The people he was listening to were people like Rudy Giuliani, who was telling him that he won. And so, he lied effectively, continued to feed that lie, continued to rile up his supporters saying your democracy is being stolen, your country is being stolen. They gathered them on January 6th. Remember, January 6th was picked because that was the day that the vote was going to be certified. And the reason they had that rally was because this crackpot theory emerged that Mike Pence could overturn the election. And our friend Bert Lyko wrote about this in Ordinary Times, that this was just nonsense. There was no legal way that Mike Pence could overturn the election. And even Congress could at most send those certifications back to the states to confirm them. They couldn't just override them. And so the people were gathered there on a false premise. They were then riled up, they were turned loose. And the main violence was started by the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, but those were also stimulated. Another thing that's come out of the January 6th committee was when Donald Trump at the debate was asked to denounce the Proud Boys and told them to stand by, that they used that as a recruiting tool. That was one of the things that they used to build up their numbers to the point where they could breach the Capitol. And so, Ashli Babbitt was a grown woman. She had agency. She made her decisions. But I think you have to put some responsibility on the people who gathered a mob, set them loose, knowing that violence might happen, that someone might get killed. They didn't specifically single out her, but they set the mob loose in a circumstance that might result in people dying. And, there's a very specific legal definitions of who's responsible, incitement and all those. Again, our lawyer friends write about that. So there's not a legal responsibility, but there is, I think, a moral responsibility for what happened. There's a line in the Bible I'm fond of quoting that you shall not put a stumbling block in front of the blind, which is interpreted by most sages to mean don't put people in positions where they're tempted to do bad things. Don't provoke people to do bad things. And I think in this case, with 2 months of lies and the rally and everything else that was going on, that created a situation where someone could die. And so if you want to put responsibility on people, I think that's where at least some of the responsibility goes. Not a legal responsibility, but a moral responsibility.
Yeah, set up to fail is the phrase that I always use. That's the same line of thought there. They were set up to fail. Here's my problem. I've spent a lot of time lately banging on our current president, Joe Biden, because his words matter. And I don't care if you're talking fuel prices, the economy, or whatever. You can't be big talking Sheriff Joe and say certain things because it matters and it holds up and people listen to it and countries respond to it, markets respond to it. My problem with Donald Trump has always been from the beginning, I don't think he's a QAnon believer. I don't think he believes all this conspiracy stuff, but he played footsies with it and allowed it because it suited his purposes. But the problem is, and because he was so self-centered and because he doesn't have any leadership qualities, and I know people talk about him being a leader, we'll hash that out some other times, but this is bad leadership qualities. He never stopped to do accountability to understand that, there's people that really will believe this, and they'll not only believe it, they'll act on it, and they'll fight for it. And in this case, people died because of it. But he doesn't have any accountability to understand that his words mattered, that one line of him in a 2015 debate of saying, no, QAnon's utter nonsense, and most of this goes away. Those are always going to be the diehards. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't have been this build and build and build and build and build thing. But he played footsies with it because it suited his purpose. It flattered his ears. It flattered his ego. He liked it. And this is the end result. I think he absolutely has moral responsibility for January 6th. I think he has direct responsibility because obviously his inner circle had quite a bit to do with this, with what we're learning from John Eastman and others. And I don't care if you get mad. That's just the facts on the ground. He has moral culpability. I don't think there's going to be criminal liability here because I just don't see them making that case. But we have 5 years of Donald Trump playing footsies with this people. And this was the ultimate result of him because he was never going to stop them as long as they were acting on his behalf. I don't know any other way to call that but being culpable. Am I way off base? But that's just where, beyond politics, beyond policy, beyond parties, you started this ball rolling, you kept it rolling, and when it ended up chasing you out of the temple as a big rock that almost crushed everything, if a few things hadn't broke, and only, I have no idea why we didn't have a body count attached to January 6th when you watch all that video back. It all started with him year after year after year after year of no accountability and not standing up to this nut jobbery and saying this is nonsense because he liked it and it flattered him. And that's morally repugnant to me.
Yeah, and the comparison I sometimes make is to September 11th conspiracy theories. Whenever I would hear a congressperson make noises in that direction. I would get really angry because you're lending credibility to a conspiracy theory that is going to motivate people to do bad things. And QAnon, for those of you who don't know, QAnon is this theory that emerged on the internet that there was actually a secret satanic cannibal pedophile cabal in Washington, and Donald Trump was elected to bring all these people to justice. And he was asked several times, what do you think of this? Can you denounce it and so forth? And he said, well, I don't know much about it. I just know they support me and that's great. And when you let these things fester, they get bad.
That's almost worse, really. I mean, it really is.
It is winking at it.
Because then you're either too stupid to function or you're in on it. Either which way, you're out.
And even aside from January 6th, I mean, Ashli Babbitt was steeped in QAnon stuff. Even aside from that, this stuff is tearing apart families. I mean, people have abducted their own children because they think their spouse is part of this conspiracy theory. This has been really bad.
The Pizzagate thing, the guy walked into Comet Pizza with an assault rifle, and by the miracle of God didn't kill a bunch of people because he realized it was crazy.
Yeah, they came up with this idea that pizza orders for Comet Ping Pong Pizza were actually orders for sex slaves. And some guy went in there with a rifle to rescue all the sex slaves, and thankfully no one was killed. But this stuff has consequences. And, imagine if you had a Democratic president who was feeding 9/11 or winking at 9/11 conspiracy theories rather than just rejecting them, and what that would motivate. When you tell people that members of Congress are literally eating children, and that is fed and not denounced by people in power, what do you think is going to happen? When our children in danger is one of those things that bypasses our normal moral filters. That when we hear that a child is in danger of being hurt or harmed or killed, we want to do everything we can to save them. It's just a natural instinct. It is a moral thing for human beings. That's part of how we're wired. And when you have something like QAnon wiring into that, you were talking about something tapping into very, very dangerous and powerful instincts that can motivate people to do really awful things.
Michael Siegel, our good friend. This is a heavy conversation, but I think we have to have it because I think we keep taking these things piecemeal instead of taking them broad picture like this. We talked about that broad brush Mastriano used earlier. There's so much to this. I think we got to keep coming back out and zoom out a little bit and just go, no, this did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a sequence, and the sequence is really, really important here. Just real quick, in a few minutes we got left, I'm not optimistic about the results of the January 6th commission. I don't think Congress should have been investigating this anyway, because number one, you don't let victims of a crime prosecute the crime, and number two is we now know there was people that was involved in it. On top of that, this should have been a special prosecutor, that sort of thing. This should have never been a congressional committee. However, they did it. We're going to get some information out of it. I'm not super optimistic anything actionable is going to actually come out of this. What's your thoughts on it?
I sort of agree. I think that's the key feeling of everyone, that not a lot of actionable stuff is going to come out of it. I think that a lot of information is being revealed. I mean, I'm kind of a political junkie, and some of the stuff coming out is information to me about how so much of this was spearheaded by the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and so forth. So I think having that information out there is going to be helpful. But in terms of if it's going to move the needle on anyone, how they feel about January 6th, I don't know. I think it may be at the fringes. I don't think it's going to result in any legal consequences for anyone. That's already being handled by the Justice Department. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's hard to anticipate how people are going to respond to things politically. But yeah, I sort of agree that I don't think this is going to move a lot of people's feelings on this issue.
No, I think this cake is baked and everybody's pretty much where they're at on it, unfortunately. But there will be, I think in hindsight, there'll be information here that'll be important for the future. Michael Siegel, my good friend, I appreciate your time. Next time you come back on, we're going to go back to talking about science. I promise. We've had you politics a little heavy lately. We'll, because there's actually some really cool stuff going on in the space realm right now that we want to get to. And tell us what you got going on. Why are there dinosaurs chasing you on your background there? And let folks know about where you're writing in your social media, my friend, especially that great YouTube channel you got where you cover sci-fi.
The dinosaurs are because I'm in the midst of watching the BBC Apple TV Plus series Prehistoric Planet, which is a nature documentary about dinosaurs with Attenborough and so forth. If you've seen Blue Planet or any of the things he's done, it's in that style. And it's,
How many syllables does he use for Bronchiosaurus?
oh, probably about 47, but
He's
but
like 98, isn't he?
he's 96 years old.
96,
I hope I get to that age and have a tenth of his energy at 96. But it's an extraordinary documentary, and if you have the means, if you have a subscription or have access to BBC, I highly recommend it. Probably in a month, the big thing that's going to happen is a release of the first science images and results from JWST. So that will be really fun when that happens. And I just did a video on the science of Star Wars, which a lot of people really liked, and hopefully do another video in a couple weeks.
I set off a Twitter argument over the Millennial Falcon because it's supposed to be a cargo ship. And the debate is, well, now they've retconned it. It's not actually a cargo ship. It's a tugboat. It was to push other freight that was stacked up, which actually makes it cooler in my mind that they were flying around in a tugboat. But I was like, it can't be a cargo vessel because I'm a transporter by trade. You can't load freight on that. That's comically bad freight design. But maybe we may have to do a joint one on just, the transportation fallacies of media. There'll be like 6 people that care about it, but I care about it. Michael Siegel, my good friend, I appreciate you, sir. One last really quick question, though, because I just have to ask you at least one science related thing. Do you think they will actually succeed in killing off daylight savings time?
I hope so. The evidence is that it doesn't save any energy, but it hurts people's health and causes traffic accidents. So I certainly hope so. I think it's one of those things that everyone knows is bad and no one's willing to stop. So maybe it'll happen on a state by state basis, but I hope so.
What a statement for the times we live in. Everybody knows it's bad, but nobody wants to stop it. Dr. Michael Siegel, our really good friend. Thanks for the time, my friend. And we'll do something a little lighter next time. I promise, buddy.
All right. Glad to be on again.
Thank you, sir.